In the last lecture, we have seen that the warehouses are one of the most important concepts in Snowflake because they provide us with the compute capacity to execute the workload. So for example, our queries. And therefore in this lecture, we want to have a closer look at those warehouses in practice. So we want to see how we can set up a new warehouse and how we can manage them. So there are two ways of doing this. The first one is using this interface and the second one is using SQL commands in our worksheets. So therefore, let's have a look at, in this lecture, at the option number 1 to create a warehouse in the interface. First of all, I want to say that we need to have the role of account admin or security admin to be able to see the existing warehouse that is available per default. So if I go into the admin section and there under warehouses, I can see this warehouse and the owner of this is the account admin. So this is just available per default, and therefore if I switch to the role of, for example, public, I won't be able to see any warehouse. So we talk about the roles in a little bit more detail later on, but for now I just quickly wanted to mention this, that we have to have the right role selected. So you can see that the role public can actually not even create warehouses. However, we have the role sysadmin, which can actually create warehouses. Also, the user admin can not create warehouses as well, but the sysadmin is actually able to do that. So sysadmin is able to do that, and the security admin, which is basically the second most powerful after the account admin, this can also see this warehouse, but you can see that this one cannot create new warehouses. So we talk about those roles in a bit more detail later on. For now, just for the sake of simplicity, we can either take the account admin or the sysadmin. So the sysadmin is usually the role that is managing the warehouses, but in the beginning, to set up the account, it is also possible to use the account admin. In our case, it doesn't really make a big difference, but we will use the sysadmin, so this is more in alignment with the best practices. All right, so we have the warehouses, and now when we want to set up a new warehouse, we can just click on this button plus warehouse. So first of all, we give it a name. We can say this is our first warehouse. And afterwards, we could also add a comment just to make it a bit more descriptive. And for the size, we can choose again extra small because we won't have very complicated queries in the beginning. So this is more cost saving because you can see that in this case, the number of servers that are used is doubling with each increase of the size. So you see, we also use the double amount of credits. So here with small, we have 2 credits per hour. And now we are paying for those credits based on a few things. So the first important thing is that mostly this is based on the edition that we are using. So in our case, we are using probably the Enterprise Edition if you have selected the same as I have done. So in this case, you also have this one selected. And in here, we have, depending on the platform that we are using and also the region, some smaller differences as well. So for example, let's say I'm choosing maybe EU, and then here in this case, it is maybe a bit more expensive. And maybe if I choose Microsoft Azure, for example, there can be also some additional differences. So here it is depending on which platform and region we have selected, but mostly it depends on the edition. So we can see in this case, $3 per credit per hour, or like $3 per credit. And now if we go back to the creation of our warehouse, we also have the advanced options. So here, let's have a look at this to see how the warehouses actually work. So here we see we have these auto resume and auto suspend. And this also shows us already some interesting feature about the warehouses. So we have the option to automatically suspend a warehouse if it is inactive for a specific period. So if we have it selected, for example, to 5 minutes, after it's not been used actually, because we always pay for the activity when it is running, but if it is not used for example, more than 5 minutes, then it will be automatically suspended. So this is very much recommended to save cost and not by accident just have a warehouse running, because then we pay the full price. And additionally, when we have this auto suspend selected, it is also recommended to use auto resume. And yeah, then we automatically, when we start a query again, will use the warehouse and it will be started automatically. So we don't need to manually start it again, because this could cause some issues if, for example, the warehouse is used in a report in another application, and then automatically it will be resumed for us. Afterwards, we can also see this very interesting option of a multi-cluster warehouse. Especially in larger organizations, this is also recommended. So it is good to use this multi-cluster warehouse because this makes it more dynamic. This means based on the workload, we can have a minimum number of clusters and a maximum number of clusters. So when there's, for example, in the afternoon, some peak hours, then additional clusters can be added to our multi-cluster warehouse so that we are more powerful when we need it. And then we can also slow it down and it is getting a little bit cheaper again. So here we have this number of clusters. So for example, we can set it to 3. And then the scaling policy we talk about in a little bit more detail after we have set up the warehouse as well. But just to be very simple, standard is just a little bit more on the side of performance. This means a new cluster will be spinned up a little bit faster. And it is just a bit more conservative by conserving more credit. So it's a bit more economical, but it may take a little bit more time until an additional cluster is spinned up. So here we are just a little bit more on the side of saving credits, whereas with standard, we are a little bit more on the side of having a bit of a better performance. So we are earlier in spinning up additional clusters. In our case, let's just actually choose standard. This is fine for us. And then we also have this option, query acceleration. Here we have some specific types of queries where we can benefit from that. So if we click here on learn more, we can see that there are specific queries where we can have a much better performance, but then also there are additional costs associated with it. And in our case also, this is too specific. We don't need to have this used because we are just using very basic, and for the most queries we also don't need this option. All right, so now with this setup we can go ahead and create the warehouse. And also additionally, actually, let's quickly mention the difference between standard and snowpark optimized. So the standard is the one that we use actually just in most cases. So this is just the standard warehouse. We in almost all cases use this standard type. But then we also have the snowpark optimized warehouse. So here we have a little bit of a different type of warehouse. So it has larger memory and more cache. So if we have very memory intensive operations, it is optimized for this. So this is optimized basically for snowpark, which can be used for specific types of machine learning workloads, very complex queries. But in most cases, we have the better option with standard. But with these specific machine learning oriented queries that are maybe very complex and memory intensive, we can benefit again from a better performance. But this of course comes then with an additional price. So in our case, we just select standard, we go ahead and create the warehouse, and then we will see in just a second that this warehouse has been created. It is now visible to us. We can see this role is the owner. It is currently started. So per default, it is started. We can see it is just started with one cluster. The other ones are inactive, so they are not being used, but there are no queries running and also no queries queued. And we could now go ahead and in our worksheet, so if we go to projects and we would maybe use our first worksheet, for example, we could now select this warehouse. So you can see in this case, no warehouse is selected. Of course, we have to grant now also permissions. So we can see in this case, it is not visible yet. We would have to grant those permissions afterwards. But for example, if I use the role account admin, I can see that this warehouse can be now used for our workload. So I can select it and then we have this set up. All right. So this was the first option. And now in the second option, we want to see how this can be done also using the interface and SQL commands. In the last lecture, we have seen how we can create a warehouse using the interface. And now we also want to see how this can be done also using SQL commands, because this is a little bit more reproducible and in some sense also a bit more scalable. We can just copy and paste code, maybe modify a few properties, and like this easily create the warehouses. Alright, so to see how this works, we want to navigate to the projects, and then under worksheets, we can just select our existing first worksheet, and in here we can also use the SQL commands to set up our warehouse. To do this, we just use the command create warehouse. We can also add create or replace, so if this warehouse would already exist with the same name, it would be just replaced. So this is just optional, but we can use it like this. And also what you note is that here in the context, we use, of course, the role to create this warehouse to execute this command. So therefore here we need to have selected the sysadmin or also the account admin. We follow the best practice and use the sysadmin. And here we can then execute the command. So we use create or replace warehouse. So again, warehouse, and we can just again use autocomplete, and we have to give it now first of all a name. So this could be, for example, just something simple like second warehouse like this, and afterwards we use with. And after that, we can now specify all of the properties of the warehouse, how this should be created. So of course, the first property and the most important one is the warehouse size. So this is the main property of our warehouse. So we specify this by using the property warehouse size, and then we say equal to, and now we can just say, for example, small, or in our case, we can even say X small. So then it will be extra small. And afterwards, we can also, if we want this to be a multi-cluster warehouse, specify the parameters min cluster count and max cluster count. So I can say max cluster count is equal to 1. And maybe min cluster count, so usually it makes more sense, but we can also just have the role or the order switched, so it makes a bit more sense logically to use min cluster count in the first place. So this is 1, and then max cluster count maybe is 3. And afterwards, we also have the properties of auto suspend and auto resume. So auto resume we can say to true, and let's maybe just create it actually without it so that we can see how the default value is, because we don't necessarily need to specify that. And of course in the end we could also say that we want to add a comment, so this is also possible in the interface, and we could also do that here. So we just say comment, this is our second warehouse. And now if we execute the command like this, again using Control Enter, it will just execute it. We can see we have not specified this correctly, so we should maybe add here a equal sign, and then it would be created. So here we just forgot about this equal sign, and then we have now this warehouse created, and you can see that this is automatically started when we create it. We could also create it in a way where it is initially suspended. Maybe we don't want to use it, so we could add this as an additional parameter. So you see we have lots of control here, and in this case we could use initially suspended. So here we have suspended, and if we set this property to true, it would be initially suspended. So we can just basically in this case replace the existing one. So in this case, of course, let's maybe use the first warehouse in this case. So we just select it to execute this command, and here we say we want to create it, and then we can see that now it is suspended. So you can see per default it is suspended. And by the way, we actually don't even need a warehouse to execute this command, because this is done by the cloud service layer. So we don't need to pay for the usage of a warehouse to create a warehouse. So this is more of an administrational task that will be done by the cloud service layer. So we use the compute capacity from the cloud service layer instead of a dedicated warehouse, which is more to execute our own workload and not so much with these administrative tasks. All right, so this is created now like this, and we can also see now that this warehouse that we have created has some properties. So for example, we can see if we have this one selected and click on this properties icon, that here are those properties. So what we can see is the command now auto resume is enabled and auto suspend is per default also set to 300 seconds. We could also create it with a lower number of seconds. So for example, we could say auto suspend if we add it maybe just somewhere here. So for example, I say I want to have auto suspend set to, for example, only 5 minutes. Then we specify 300 seconds. So this is equal to 5 seconds. So we have auto suspend set to 300. And then if we create it like this, we can see that now if we have a look at the properties, it is set to 300 seconds, which is 5 minutes, which maybe it's a bit better in our case. And also, of course, the scaling policy can be set here. So we can just use the different properties that we have available. So I could say, for example, let's say if I go here to add the scaling policy, so I can say scaling policy, and then I set this maybe to a value of, let's say, economy. And if I execute it like this, now it is set up with the scaling policy economy. So like this, we can also control those parameters in here. And we have now successfully set up also the warehouse using CQL commands. And now in the next lecture, we also want to see how we can manage the warehouses very briefly. So how we can alter them, how we can drop them. That's what we want to have a look at in the next lecture. Now that we have seen how we can create a warehouse, we also quickly want to see how we can alter an existing warehouse and also how we can delete it. So first of all, to alter this object, we can use the command alter warehouse. Very simple. Afterwards, we specify the name. So let me just start with alter warehouse and then which warehouse we want to alter. In our case, it is the second warehouse, and you again see you have here this autocomplete. So I can just use the help of this, and then we can specify what we want to alter. One of the most common things is, we have already seen, we can see that this is now suspended. We can suspend a running warehouse, and also we can start it. So I can say, if I want to start it, I want to resume it. So I just use the keyword resume, I execute it, and then it should be resumed automatically. And we can also say we want to suspend it. So like this, it would be then immediately suspended. So here we can see now it is suspended again. But if we want to change a property, we just use the keyword set, and afterwards we specify the property and then the new value of the property. For example, we want to modify the warehouse size. So we just say set and then the property, which is warehouse size, and then we specify just a new value. For example, in this case, we don't want to have small, but we want to set it to, let's say, we can say this one currently is extra small, so we could change it to just small. And if I run it like this, it would be modified to small, which we can already see in here. And by the way, you can either use those single quotes or you can also leave them. This both works in this case. So if I run it like this, it would also work. So now I have it again changed to extra small. This is what we want to have. And also we can use the property, for example, auto suspend. So in a similar way, like we have seen it when we created the warehouse, we have the same properties. We just now can change the values. So we say auto suspend. And in this case, if I want to change it from 300 seconds, for example, to let's say 1 minute, so I say 60 seconds, then I can also do it like this. And now if I have a look at the properties, it is set to 60 seconds. So like this, we can also alter it. Of course, we can also drop an existing warehouse. And to do this, we just use the drop command. So we would say we drop warehouse. So let me just use drop warehouse just drop warehouse and then the name of the warehouse, and that's it. So like this, we can also drop it. If I execute it, I see now no warehouse is selected because we have just dropped the existing warehouse. Okay. And the same thing we can also, of course, do using the interface. So to do this, we can just navigate here back to home, and then under the admin section where we find our existing warehouses, we can see this is still visible, but if we refresh, it should also disappear. And here we can also modify an existing warehouse. For example, if we want to modify this one, we can go here to these three dots, and here we can do the same thing. So we can drop it, we can resume it, we could also transfer the ownership, and we can also edit it. So if I go to edit, you can just see again this simple wizard where you can also now modify those existing properties. For example, the maximum number of clusters, the scaling policy. We have here suspend after. I could, for example, say 1 minute, I save it, and then I have also successfully modified the warehouse in the same way like I have done it using CQL commands. So under the hood, there are always just the CQL commands used, but it can be sometimes, especially when we are not so familiar maybe with CQL, we can also use here this interface. Okay, so this was just a quick overview over we can also now manage or alter an existing warehouse and how we can drop it. Hope it was helpful, and see you in the next lecture. So now let's talk about the different scaling policies for scaling our clusters up and down in the context of a multi-cluster warehouse. Of course, this is relevant. We've already learned about the multi-clusters. So in general, if we have one warehouse, for example, of the size S, at a certain time it can happen that we have more queries than this single warehouse can process. This will cause a problem because users now will have to wait very long until their queries are processed. So the solution to this is that we can automatically scale, depending on the workload, dynamically our clusters. This means we can dynamically shut down clusters or start additional clusters in a multi-cluster warehouse. So you can see here additional clusters can be added to our multi-cluster warehouse. So by doing this, we can just redistribute the queries that are basically in queue and that can currently not be processed by the existing single cluster, and like this we redistribute them so that we can process them and the users don't have to wait. So this is what we mean by our multi-cluster warehouse and by the auto scaling. And in this lecture we now want to discuss how this auto scaling works exactly, and in this context we need to discuss about the two different scaling policies. We have standard and economy. And before we dive into this in detail, let's also stress the use case of those multi-clusters. So when we have more workload, this means when we have more queries, for example, we have times when we have more users. For example, we have some peak hours in the afternoon, then we have more users, more queries, and this is exactly the use case when we use those multi-cluster warehouses, because in this case, this is very efficient for handling more workload, so more queries, for example, by more users. A good use case is not when we have more complex queries. In this case, if the queries are more complex and therefore we need more compute capacity, it would be more suitable to increase the size of the existing warehouse instead of spinning up additional clusters. So this out of the way, we want to now understand the different auto scaling policies. So to understand the difference between the two scaling policies, let's see again how the multi-cluster works in detail. So here, if we see we have more queries than an existing single cluster or single warehouse, for example, of this size S, can actually process at the moment, then there will be a queue, as we can see in here. And in this case, the users have to wait. So here we can now additionally start a new cluster when we have this queue. But the question now is, at what moment exactly we will spin up an additional cluster? So this is exactly where the different scaling policies come into play, because they have different criteria for when we start this additional cluster. So the standard scaling policy, we have seen that these are the two different options, and the standard scaling policy is the default. So this just favors the performance. Basically, it favors starting additional warehouses and like this maintain the performance at a higher level over conserving the credit consumption. So under this policy, a cluster is started basically immediately when a query would be queued, or even if the system detects that there are more queries that can be processed currently by the available clusters. So it will be pretty much starting the additional clusters very quickly. And under this policy, a cluster will be shut down after 2 to 3 so-called consecutive successful checks. A check is performed once every minute, and the check is done to determine if the load on the least loaded cluster can be successfully redistributed to the other clusters, meaning that the current amount of clusters can be easily reduced, or can be successfully reduced to one less cluster, and we can still handle the existing workload. So this is how it would be shut down in the standard policy. And in the economy scaling policy, as we know, this favors conserving the credits over starting additional warehouses. Here it would start an additional cluster only if the system detects that there's enough query load to keep the clusters busy for at least 6 minutes. So in this economy policy, a cluster will then be also shut down after 5 to 6 consecutive successful checks. So again, to summarize this, the standard policy just favors performance, starts the cluster immediately when it's needed, or even when we detect that there are more queries that can be processed by the currently available clusters. And the economy policy is just favoring conserving credits. So it would start a cluster only if the workload is sufficient for 6 minutes or more. And we have now seen how those different policies, standard and economy, works. And in the next lecture, we want to talk about now the basic and most important thing that we should know about in Snowflake. And this is the creation and the management of databases. And now let's move on from the theory and look at some very important and basic thing that is we have to know how to create and manage databases and tables in Snowflake. So that's what we want to have a look at in the next lecture. Of course, if we want to manage our Snowflake account, it is very important that we know how to navigate databases, schemas, and table and the other database objects, and how we can create them, how we can manage them. So therefore, we want to have a look at how this works. So again, we can create and manage them using both the interface and also SQL commands. If we want to use the interface, we remember that under worksheets, when we, for example, use this worksheet and then we navigate from this worksheet section into databases, we can see that here we can, for example, expand the Snowflake sample database. And here we have the schemas. So the schemas are just a logical container basically for our objects, our database objects. And here, for example, we see we only have tables, but we can have additional database objects like schemas, stages, and many more that we will of course later on discuss in a bit more detail. So if we want to manage this using the interface, we can write the code here in this editor as well to create tables and so on and alter them and so on, but we can also see and manage them using the interface. So to do this, we just navigate to this data section, and in here under databases, we can see again the overview over the existing databases. Of course, we should select the role that has access to those databases. In our case, to see everything, let's just select the account admin. And in here, we can now also create a new database. Of course, we can also dive into an existing one. So we see here the schema and then the tables. We can select them. And then we see here, these are the details. We have like the privileges. Then we have here the column names. And we can also see a preview of the data. This is using a warehouse because here we need to run a query. So here we can just see this in a little bit more of an easy way, more interactively. And also what we can do is we can use, if we just go back to the overview of databases, we can also click here to see the details and then navigate to the schemas and see what we have available in here. So this can also be done. If I want to go back to this one, I can always click here on the databases up here. And here, for example, again, we can dive into the schemas and here then again into the objects. So in this case, we only have tables, so we can see those tables here. And if we select them, we can also get a preview of the data. What we want to do here is we want to create a new database, and then in this database a new schema, and then from there a table that we have created. Okay, to do this we just navigate back to the overview of all of the databases, and then in here we can now click on plus database. So here we can give it a name. For example, we can say this is something like first DB. We can give it a comment, for example, this is our first database. This is just to understand what is this database about. It is optional, but we can create it like this, and then it will be created from here. So you can see even by this icon that this is a standard database, and this one is just a share. So this is more of a system database, and this is a normal shared database. And we talk about those shares later on in the course. This is not so important for us now. So here we have a normal database that we have created. We can select it, and in here we can see the privileges, so the details. And again, we also talk about the privileges and the roles later on in more detail. So we don't need to understand everything from now, but here we could also now already add additional privileges. This means that we can select a role where we want to grant those privileges to. For example, we want to grant it to the public, or let's say the security admin, and then it will be also inherited to the throughout the hierarchy of the roles. And we talk about this hierarchy later on. So the lowest level is the public. So when we have the security admin, it will be also inherited to the next level. So account level will always have access to everything. Even if we granted to the public role, account admin will always then also have access. So this will always be the top level role. And if we, for example, just to demonstrate this, grant the privilege to the security admin, of course, the public role, which is at the bottom, will not have access. So here you can see we can just have all kinds of different privileges. For example, create schema. So if I do this, maybe I want to do this to, let's say, the user admin. So I grant create schema, and I can also check the grant option, which would mean that then this user admin can also grant the privilege further to other roles. So in our case, we don't need to check it. We can say just grant privileges, and then we see it is available in here. And now if we use the role user admin, which per default would not be able to create a schema, we could do that also using this role. So you can see if I use the public role, I cannot even see this. So yeah, here you see there are many privileges necessary. And if I have actually the role user admin, probably it also won't work, because yeah, in this case, I can see that I can now, using this role, also create a schema. In our case, let's again just switch back to the account admin. And in here, we can now create a schema. So to do this, we can say we create a schema. And here we say this is first schema, for example, and we can say we want to manage access. So this is create schema, and then we can say we want to create this. Okay, so now that we have this set up, we can go into the worksheets, and we can also see that this is now available. And from within this schema, we can of course now also select this, and here we can create now our database objects. And again, don't worry, we talk about those different things like streams, pipes, file formats, stages, and so on later on in this course. But here we could say we create a table. We could create it from an existing query, so then the data in this table would be just the output of an existing select query, or we can just create it as an empty table. So So if we do this, basically we open this in a worksheet. So you see under the hood, there's always the CQL at play. And in here, we could also say we want to open it directly in the worksheets. So we can work from within here. And here I could say, this is our first table. And then we can specify the column names. So for example, we say this is the, let's say, first column. And note that you never use, ideally, the white spaces in the database objects. So here, if I would want to do it, I could do it. Then I would have to use these quotes. But usually we just use something like an underscore. So we say first table, and here the type. So this is maybe an integer, and let's say this is first column. So let's call it like this. And then we could create another column. So we could say comma, and then we have the second column. So second column. And let's say this is just something like text, very basic. Yeah, here we don't need to be very specific. And we could also comment this out. So we remove those two dashes, and then we could add a comment. So we say this is our first table, and then again we create this using the account admin. So per default, the account admin will be then the owner because we created, and then we have full privileges on this object because we have created this object. Okay, so if I execute it like this, I can see it is now available. And if I now run something like select star from this table, first table, we can use autocomplete, and then I just select this command, I execute it, I can see, I can run the query, I can see those columns, but there is currently no data. Okay, so of course this was an overview and this was already a lot. So hope this gave you the first impression of how we can use the interface, how we can create tables and schemas. And of course now step by step, we want to dive deeper into those important topics. So before we dive into the further details, which we will do in the next sections, we finally also want to load data. This is a very common use case. So to get an understanding of this out of the gate, we want to see how this works. Okay, so to do this, you can also, of course, download this text file from the resources in this lecture, and we can just copy and paste them into our editor. And here we want to demonstrate the very important copy into command, or just copy command, where we copy data from an existing file or multiple files from an external cloud provider like an S3 bucket on AWS, and we want to load the data from this CSV file into an existing table in Snowflake. A very common use case, and this command is very important, and of course therefore we dive deeper into this later on in much more detail, but we want to give a first practical idea about how this works. Okay, so let's demonstrate this and load data into our table. To do this, we first want to get things a little bit cleaned up. So therefore, we want to alter the first database to our first DB, just that we are aligned with all of the further lectures, because there we will use the name our first DB. So to keep it aligned, we want to first start by altering, basically renaming this first DB. Okay, so to do this, we select it, and then we can just execute it. So we can see if we refresh our objects, you can see now it's first DB here, and if we refresh it, it should have changed. So now it's called our first DB. Step number 2 is we want to create a table in this database. And as you can see in here, the public schema is always there per default. So you can see this is always available, and the role public has also access to this public schema, by the way. So to create a table, we just use the create table command and then the name of the table. And if we have not selected the context up here, so here you see we have the context set if we maybe want to do it. So it's not updated. So we could say this is the context, our first DB, and then public. But we could also just always use the fully qualified table name. And additionally, we can also use those double quotes. In this case, it is case sensitive. So usually if we are not using them, then it would be always defaulting to these capitalized letters, but we could also, if we want to force it, use those double quotes to make it case sensitive, and we could also include white spaces. In general, both of this is not recommended, so we should just, if we want to use something like a white space, instead use an underscore, and ideally we have everything in all caps. In this case, if we want to force it, as you can see in here, just to demonstrate it, we could also use those double quotes. And then afterwards, after we have the column name, we have just the data type of this column, and this is all separated by a comma. So let's go ahead and create this table, which is about loan payments. So we create this table, and in this table we want to load the data from an external bucket, and you can do this along with me if you want. So we see table has been created. We want to check that this table actually exists. So here again, I can just use this name of the table without the database name and the schema name, so not fully qualified, because I have selected it up here in the context. So if you see, if I execute it like this, I can see the table exists. Of course, currently it is empty, and I can also change the context using CQ commands, not only using this navigation, but also, for example, in here I could say, for example, let me use this one, so I can just change it, and I can say I want to place the name into the editor. So this is a bit easier, I don't have to type it out, and then I would change it up here. But of course, let me use Control Z to go back to the previous one. So if we use this database, so we just use the command use database and execute it, we don't need to use this fully qualified table name, so it can be a bit more convenient to work now in this database. So here we can now see this table exists, and now we want to use the copy command. So how this copy command works, we dive deeper into later on, but for now we start with copy into, and then the table name where we want to copy this into, and then just simply from, and then the source. So here we have the source. This is a publicly available bucket, so this makes it easy to copy from there, and later on we also see how this works in more complex scenarios. But we can see this is just the path basically of this bucket where this CSV file sits. So we have access to this because it's publicly available, and I can now here also specify the file format. So this is part of the copy into command. And here we see the type is a CSV file. The file is delimited, so the fields, by a comma. And also we have skip header set to true. This means there will be a header, and we do not treat the header as data. So the first row will be basically just skipped because there is not data in it, but it's just the field names. So 1 is basically the value true. So let's go ahead and copy the data into this existing table and see if this first of all works. And then we want to check that this is actually, containing now some data. So you can see after we have executed this, status is loaded. Very nice. Here the file that has been loaded, we have past 500 rows, and all of them also have been loaded. And we can see there was no error, so everything looks very fine. Now let's also double check this, that we have actually some data now in our table. And indeed, we have now successfully loaded the first data into our first table. So this was, of course, just a brief overview, but hopefully it was already practical and helpful. And now in the next lectures, we want to step by step dive deeper into those topics.